from the dailymail.co.uk, written by Stephen Glover. Why do so many lefties and luvvies loathe this country? There's a long and inglorious history of British intellectuals, notably on the left, disparaging their own country. George Orwell described the phenomenon in 1941 when Britain was fighting for its survival. Quote, "England is perhaps the only country whose intellectuals are ashamed of their own nationality. In left-wing circles, it's always felt that there is something slightly disgraceful in being an Englishman, and that it is a duty to snigger at every British institution." End quote. Nothing has changed. At a press conference in Berlin on Tuesday, the actress and self-declared socialist Emma Thomason witheringly referred to her country as, quote, "a tiny little cloud-blotted rainy corner of sort of Europe. I mean, really, a cake-filled, misery-laden, grey old island."
Movies about being brave, about saying things that are not popular. And so I would say, and Daniel actually addressed this earlier this morning, so I might hand it over to him as well, because he's living in Germany at the moment, and I'm living in Europe, of course, as it were. Well, a tiny little cloud-bolted, rainy corner of sort of Europe. I mean, really, not sort of, cake-filled, misery-laden, grey old island. But anyway, the sense of people turning their backs on people who need help, I think is, not being able to say the truth, not being able to say what you really feel, I think is very current at the moment. Yes.
Emma Thomason labels Britain a misery-laden, grey old island. Note the imputation of smallness. Britain, in her estimation, is not only dismal, but also so peripheral and irrelevant that it makes no sense by itself. It follows that its future can only be in Europe. Miss Thomason declares that she feels European and says it would be madness for Britain to leave the EU. By the way, what does she mean by cake-filled? Is this a dig at our national obsession with baking, as exemplified by the BBC programme The Great British Bake Off? Or is she suggesting in a haughtily dismissive, rather nasty way that Britons are fat because they eat too many cakes? So there we have it. Miss Thomason may be a slight figure given to ill-considered outbursts, but what she said in Berlin isn't running down our own country abroad especially bad form, represents not just the views of mushy-headed loveydom, but also large swathes of the British left. When George Orwell wrote his essay in 1941, he blamed fellow leftists before the war for chipping away at English morale, trying to spread an outlook that was sometimes squashily pacifist, sometimes violently pro-Russian, but always anti-British. He was thinking of people such as Sidney and Beatrice Webb, founders of the London School of Economics, who, in the 1930s, ignored Stalin's mass purges in the Soviet Union and extolled his supposed achievements. Or Professor Harold Lasky, also of the LSE, who was chairman of the Labour Party and mentor of Ralph Miliband, father of Ed. Lasky was apparently unconcerned that Soviet prisoners had their teeth smashed with iron bars, and he could not see much of a difference between the general character of a trial in Russia and this country. It's uncanny how closely the Corbynista Emma Thomason, she has expressed her admiration for the new Labour leader, is following the path described by Orwell. She feels the familiar distaste for her own country and in place of Russia finds hope and meaning in the European Union. Of course, I'm not equating the Soviet Union with the peace-loving EU, where the rule of law generally prevails. But I cannot help observing the grotesque irony that in the capital of Germany, this deluded woman should have spoken of how England's fascistic side affected the British view of Germany and World War II. She even had the nerve to grumble about being completely brainwashed by films she saw in her childhood, showing the British being marvellous and beating the Nazis. In other words, so keen is Miss Thomason to find fault with her own country that she represents Britain's role in the war as being less than heroic, while the Nazis were, relatively speaking, not as bad as is usually made out. Isn't this bonkers? It takes flagellation of one's own country to new extremes. If this garrulous actress had thought more deeply, she might have reflected that on 2 occasions last century it was Germany, not Britain, which invaded other European countries without justification, leading to the deaths of tens of millions of people. Let me ask this question. If Britain is so hopeless and the rest of the EU so wonderful, why is it that so many migrants from Europe and beyond, on whose behalf Miss Thompson has previously spoken, are beating a path to our shores rather than most other European countries? The answer is that Britain has a much more buoyant economy than almost every other nation in Europe, which is why not just Eastern Europeans, but also hundreds of thousands of French, Italian, Spaniards and others are flocking here. Needless to say, Britain has much more going for it than a comparatively strong economy. It should be celebrated for the beauty and variety of its countryside, the wonder of its ancient buildings, and the general decency of its people, for its respect for the rule of law and its love of tolerance, neither of which attributes have fared as well in most of Europe. Instead of writing off the land of her birth as a dingy little place in the edge of Europe, why can't Emma Thompson acclaim its achievement in culture and arts, including film, where she's earned a bob or two? The country, which she finds so contemptible, is in fact admired and envied by many Europeans. A love of one's own country is the most natural of instincts, like love of family. Miss Thompson evidently does not feel it. For her, patriotism is a dirty word, or something incomprehensible. Remember how in 2014 the Labour MP Emily Thornberry mockingly tweeted a photograph of a house in Rochester draped with flags of St George and the owner's white van parked in the driveway. This condescending woman has recently been promoted to Shadow Defence Secretary. To many on the left, but not of course to old working class Labour, any expression of patriotism is at best embarrassing and at worst evidence of bigotry. It's all right, though, if you put your faith in multinational club like the EU and to overlook its shortcomings and to forget the dark history of some of its member states, as it was once with the Soviet Union. Incidentally, the one thing the British intellectual left hates next to its own country is the United States of America. But Emma Thompson is too canny to turn her fire in that direction for fear of public backlash that might put pay to lucrative future Hollywood films. Over the coming weeks and months, we're going to hear a lot of comments from luvvies and writers and others, albeit probably more sophisticated than Miss Thompson's, which portray Britain as a sad, arid little country that has to remain part of the infinitely more important EU. They will try to wear down our belief in our country and our confidence in its ability to shape a future outside the European Union. They will also insinuate that those who want to leave the EU hate Europe, which is nonsense. It is possible to love Europe while believing that the European Union is bureaucratic, undemocratic, and unaccountable. My response will be to ignore the advice of anyone who celebrates the EU and depreciates this country. The only pro-EU people to whom I will listen are those who are plainly British patriots. Everything Emma Thompson said was wrong-headed. She even claimed that she lives in Great Britain and in Scotland as well. So dim is her affection for her own country that she doesn't even realise that Scotland is still part of it. If she despises Britain so much, there is a simple solution for her, which would have the added advantage of relieving us of her misunderstandings. Sell her agreeable £3.5 million house in Leafy Hampstead and go and live in Dusseldorf.